This is Justice, History, and the Law. Lectures, discussions, and interviews from the Robert H. Jackson Center in Jamestown, New York.
May 1st, 2002. Law Day 2002. Henry King spoke at the Jackson Center. Henry King, former prosecutor at the Nuremberg war trials, was the featured speaker at the Law Day 2002 celebrations at the Jackson Center. In addition to King's speech, he addressed a legal symposium which was also held at the center. Henry King, a graduate of Yale College and Yale Law School, is the author of the book The Two Worlds of Albert Speer, who was a Nuremberg defendant.
Wow, and welcome. We are to the second annual Jamestown Bar Association Robert H. Jackson Symposium. Terrific crowd, terrific evening, terrific guests. We've come an awful long way in a very short period of time, and I got to tell you, we couldn't have done it without the support of you folks. I've got some thank yous that I'm thrilled to be able to go through. And last year at this time, I told you we just had incorporated. I told you we'd just had bought the building. We had an opportunity to listen to Eugene Gerhardt last year and to tell you some of the early history of this Robert Jackson Center, which is now 1 year old. That's the kind of history we have. And there are many, many people to thank, and I would take up the rest of the evening thanking everybody, but there's three people in particular that I must stop and just pay respect because but for them and their families, we would not be here tonight. Foremost among them is Betty Linné. Betty Linné was one of the original founders and contributors to make this all happen. And Betty, thank you very much for everything you continue to do. Right in step with Betty was Carl Kappa. Carl, you heard the story probably many times, but at an oral interview I did of Carl in June of 2000, surprised me when I asked the question, who was his role model? And I would have bet $100 that any good Italian-American boy in Jamestown, New York would have said Joe DiMaggio. I obviously would have lost that $100 very quickly. Surprised me when he said it was Robert Jackson. Why? Because here's a guy that was a farm boy in Spring Creek Township, Pennsylvania, which is near Youngsville. Actually had his education in Frewsburg, went to graduate school and Jamestown High School, no college, underscoring no college, and in turn managed to become the Supreme Court Justice, variety of positions in the federal government, and to become the chief prosecutor of the largest trial in the 20th century. Carl thought that was an amazing accomplishment from a guy in this area, and he felt very strongly that it was time to pause and pay respect. And Carl will always be in our memories, and Kay Kappa is here today. And Kay, please, we want to extend our best to the families of Carl Kappa. Thank you. Carl and Betty gave us that financial boost as well as that early encouragement. Our vision took flight when we were blessed to have as our first executive director Dan Bratton. Dan immediately got caught up in the vortex of the excitement of Robert Jackson, saw the vision, in fact, immediately went into action, even I think before he even got his first check. He went down to Washington, engaged himself with Sandra Day O'Connor. A variety of doors were opened up for us, which continue to be wide open, including the Supreme Court Historical Society and variety of areas, including Chautauqua Institution. Dan, as you know, contracted pancreatic cancer soon thereafter, but stayed focused literally right up to the end. And we have the files which show that the vision that he had at that time is what we're implementing now through our board and through Raleigh Kidder. So Juanita, on behalf of the Robert Jackson Center, thank you for permitting us to have Dan for that period of time because this is part of his legacy. Thank you, Juanita. We were privileged last night to have an event extraordinaire. Official photographer of the Nuremberg trials, Ray DiDario, was here with his wife, Margaret, and we had a wonderful time reviewing 100 pictures, at least 80 of them on a PowerPoint, and 20 of those which you see along here, raised from Holyoke, Massachusetts. Came here specifically for these couple of days of the Law Day events. And we've been able to, and please take time when you're leaving today to look at these pictures. These are raised pictures. He took them at Nuremberg, some of them in an experimental mode called color, which he advised me was, in case you're curious, a speed of 10. Think about that. That's Glacier. Nevertheless, the quality is incredible, and we can't thank you enough, Ray and Margaret, for coming down and making a special effort to be with us this week. So, Ray to Ariel. There are many thanks. These pictures here are as a result of some fabulous work by Dave Anderson of Bush Industries. I don't know if Dave's here, but he did a fantastic job. Kristen Stein and Karen Livesey of the Fenton Historical Society were the ones that orchestrated this entire event, and for that, it's terrific. Kristen, wherever you are, raise your hand. There you are. Thank you very, very much. It's nice to orchestrate something which you know has been paid for. The good folks at KeyBank, Marie, Cindy, Mike here, Lou, all you folks, thanks a million for being the corporate sponsor for this Law Day event. It's been extra special. I must confess that we laid out all the heavy artillery on them, reminding the folks at KeyBank that they are the successor in interest to the First National Bank of Jamestown, and Robert H. Jackson was in fact a board member and their attorney, and so what a wonderful way to honor Robert Jackson by having this kind of exhibitry. And so Marie and them, thank you very much. This morning we had over 200 students, and we put on the first assembly ever of 10th, 11th, 12th graders from Jamestown and Southwestern. It was an audio-visual opportunity. Thomasini put together a wonderful production. I don't know, is Bob here, Bob Terryberry? Yes. Where's Bob? Hey, Bob, the best. The best. Sometime when you've earned it, you will have a chance to see Bob Terryberry play out Robert Jackson, and it was terrific. I mean, right, Henry? It was just absolutely terrific. So, Bob, thanks a million. The kids loved it, and we're going to do it tomorrow. If you could squeeze yourself in here between 9 and 10:30 and pretend that you're in 10 to 12th grade. Thanks, Bob. That was terrific. There's a lot of interesting handouts. Hopefully you got this one. This was produced by the Jamestown Post-Journal. It has an article written by somebody I'll introduce later, John Q. Barrett, as well as an article written about Henry King. And it has a lot of Jacksonisms. So for those who are writing papers, good to quote Robert Jackson. This is a wonderful source. But I want to thank the Post-Journal, and if Christy or anybody else in the Post-Journal, thank you very much for all your efforts in doing this. And that, by the way, was additionally funded by the Rotary Club of Jamestown, Chuck D'Angelo, and Dr. Lamont Cuso. So as you can see, as I'm going through this, there's a variety of folks participating in this Robert Jackson Center in this one-year experiment, which I'd like to think is working very, very well, very, very rapidly, and it's just been a wonderful experience for all of us. I'd be remiss if I didn't thank Randy Sweeney, the Chautauqua Region Community Foundation, who not only hosted us for a long period of time at their offices, but Randy has provided that infrastructure while we got up and had our own legs, which it took a little bit of time. I'm sure I've forgotten a variety of folks. John Stevens, John is here from Ithaca to see Uncle Henry speak tonight, so he made a special effort, so thank you very much. So with all that, I could keep rolling on, but I'd like to have the opportunity to introduce Raleigh Kidder. Raleigh Kidder is our executive director. Raleigh, I could have a long introduction as to his background, but I'd rather hear Henry King than listen to myself talk about Raleigh Kidder, but needless to say, he is our executive director, and Raleigh will give us a little talk on our mission and vision here. Raleigh?
Well, those of you who know me and know how strongly I feel about the GI generation in World War II and the pivotal time that was in the 20th century, I imagine you realize that I think I've now died and gone to heaven now that I'm the executive director of this organization, because Robert Jackson was the person from our hometown who ended World War II in a civilized manner. He felt that the worst carnage in human history needed to be settled at the end by the civilized nations of the world in a way that was civilized, and it was a tremendous event in human history. So I'm very happy to be here. Let me just talk to you a couple things about my job. I have a couple of main roles right now to play. One is I need to raise money, so watch out. We are going to renovate this whole structure. The building you're sitting in, this room right now, used to be a horse barn downstairs and a carriage house upstairs. The Masons, when they bought it in 1920, decided to put an auditorium in here. Then they raised the roof because they wanted more room, and in 1970 put some more money in. But a lot of work needs to be done here, and if you're sitting in a tight seat, you'll probably realize why. But we need to air condition, rewire, make this place handicap accessible, do a lot of things, and we also want to put a world-class TV radio studio up front here so that our website, which we're building for streaming capability, which means if you couldn't come tonight, you can dial on our webpage and watch what's going on here tonight. We want this place to be able to do that kind of thing. And all this takes money. We're going to put an exhibitory center out here for revolving exhibits from the Library of Congress, something that Dan Bratton got started when he was here. And there's a lot of things we want to do. So I'm on the trail right now, and we're working with our state and federal governments, but we'll be coming back, I'm sure, to many of you. Our mission, though, which is and by the way, let me just say, we are not going to be able to use these facilities at the Robert Jackson Center for our purposes, obviously, a lot of the time. And we want these places to be open to the public, to be available to this community, and we think this is a wonderful facility to have for the community. So that's just by way of clarification. In terms of our mission, we see it right now in a twofold way. We want to be involved in the education of high school kids, students, as to what justice and fairness mean, not just in terms of a courtroom of law, but in terms of their lives, of their futures. And we had 200 kids in here today. Yes, we're talking to them about Nuremberg, but we're talking to them about something much more than that. We're talking about the principles that Jackson stood for in terms of the law. And that's one of the goals in our mission. And the other is that we hope we can become a center where the nation and even the world comes to when they try to ask the question, what's the future of international law going forward as it applies to war crimes, crimes against humanity, acts of terror, and so forth? Will we be an advocacy agency? Maybe not. Maybe we'll be a framing agency to help frame these issues going forward. But we think there's a place for it. And when you meet John Barrett tonight, I'm sure you're going to see he's the kind of person, and Henry King, who can help us get there. So we're going to have a mission outside of Jamestown. But we think it can be very significant and something you're all going to be very, very proud of. Finally, let me just add one other thing. We want this to be a place where our local law practitioners feel a sense of pride. And tonight, the Jamestown Bar Association met up in a room at the other end of the building in the old mansion. And they want to make this the Jamestown Bar Association room. And we think it can be a continuing education room, not only for them, but for students, for teachers, for the community. And we want to really tie in with our local folks. So that's more or less what our mission is going to be. We're very happy to have you here tonight. And if you're, after tonight's function, if you're staying for coffee and dessert downstairs, that's fine. But we have spent over $500,000 on this building so far. A lot of it you don't see. It's in masonry, it's in a new roof, it's in new insulation, it's in $80,000 worth of structural steel above your heads to support the snow we're now going to have to deal with, since the horse heat used to melt the snow. We don't have the horses anymore. So we spent a lot of money, but we did spend some on our 4 offices out at the front as you're going out. And I want to thank Betty Lene and Jeanette Carlson, Barclay Wellman, who helped us as a consultant, because we wanted to restore those rooms in a way you'd be proud of, in a way that reflects the character of this old house, and we think we've done so. And the boardroom is probably most significant, with new chandeliers and sconces and a new rug and a boardroom table. That was the old dining room for the Kents. And in 1875, that's where Ulysses Grant had lunch on his way to Chautauqua to start Chautauqua Institution. And so when you step into that room, you're on holy ground, okay? Thank you very much for being here tonight.
Thanks, Raleigh. With that, I'd like to introduce at this point Stephen Abdella, President of the Jamestown Bar Association, to give us a talk on the significance of Law Day. Steve?
Thank you, Greg. And on behalf of the Jamestown Bar Association, I want to welcome you all here tonight. I also want to quickly thank Jamie McCallum, who was the attorney on behalf of the Bar Association who chaired this event. And he is actually still out there, I see, working and doing things, but I appreciate his help on this matter. Going forward, I just want to mention that the Bar Association is very excited about the Jackson Center and having local attorney involvement in the center's programs. In addition to co-sponsoring events such as this, I think I see volunteer lawyers participating in some of the educational programming for students. And in addition, as Greg and Raleigh mentioned, there's a room upstairs that we would like to create as a physical presence for the JBA that would become our headquarters of sorts. And last week at the regular meeting in April of the JBA, a motion was passed to have a fundraising campaign by the Bar Association to help support some of the renovations in that room. So as I say, we're very excited about that and looking forward to that in years to come. Now, Raleigh and Greg asked me to speak a little bit about the significance of Law Day, which on its face seems like a somewhat dry topic. But what I'll say is that in 2002, the significance of Law Day, I would say, relates to our constitutional democracy. In fact, it was the day itself was established by Congress over 40 years ago to celebrate that very thing, the rule of law in a constitutional democracy. And given the events of the past year, I think I would look at the separation of church and state. It's an important aspect of our constitutional democracy in that, we are fortunate that this government, which is a government of the people, does not tie religion into how the government is operated and what the rights are of individuals. Robert Jackson, I was looking at one of the quotes in the publication out there, stated that, quote, "There is no mysticism in the American concept of the state or of the nature or origin of its authority. We set up government by consent of the governed, and the Bill of Rights denies those in power any legal opportunity to coerce that consent." Now, of course, if you look back at history, you can see what happens when religion and law and government get together. And unfortunately, usually what you have is trouble. And it's oftentimes war in addition to that. All you have to do is look at, for instance, the Crusades, which was an attempt by one religion to go into the Holy Land and conquer and impose their religion on someone else. You might also look at the Spanish Armada that sailed from Spain to England in an attempt to impose one form of Christianity on another country. And of course, in today's times, we see that religion is caught up in many of the conflicts around the world. And I think what we should appreciate on Law Day is our system of government that allows for diversity of religion. And I think perhaps in our foreign policy, that type of approach is what we should be seeking amongst the countries of the world. Now, some might ask, why have a Robert H. Jackson Center and a Law Day celebration like this deep in the hinterlands of Western New York? I mean, we are seemingly so far removed from foreign policy and those concerns. But of course, again, the events of this past year show us that those of us who live here in the heartland, and that this was true even back in the 1940s, but even more so today, cannot ignore what is happening around the world. Our companies sell products all over the world, and we are deeply now affected by events on the international stage. So I think, aside from celebrating the life of Robert Jackson and all his contributions to international law, it's important to have a center deep in the heartland of America that's going to involve itself in issues of international law and American foreign policy. Enjoy the program tonight, and welcome again.
That was terrific, Steve. Thank you. Before I introduce Professor John Q. Barrett, just a note that for those who are interested, there is a book which has been authored by Professor Henry King, which will be available on the tables afterwards, called The Two Worlds of Albert Speer, Reflections of a Nuremberg Prosecutor, and it's the only book by a Nuremberg prosecutor on one of the specific defendants who was there during that trial by Robert H. Jackson. I am honored to introduce the next person, who in turn will be the person who will introduce our speaker tonight. I'm also privileged to announce that for the first time in the history of the Robert Jackson Center, we felt very determined to find somebody who could represent us in a scholastic way, in an academic way, who could take our message to a higher level. And we felt it was important to find the right person and to designate that person. Our board created the Elizabeth S. Lene Fellowship, and that Elizabeth S. Lene Fellowship has been offered to and accepted by Professor John Q. Barrett. And you might wonder why we would give it to Professor Barrett. We did too, so we checked your biography. John Barrett, a graduate of Georgetown University and Harvard Law School, is a professor of law at St. John's University in New York. He is editing and writing a biographical account. He is editing Justice Robert H. Jackson's memoir of President Franklin D. Roosevelt and writing a biographical account of Jackson's year as the chief American prosecutor before the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg. Before becoming a law professor, John was a prosecutor in the office of the independent counsel Lawrence Walsh during the Iran-Contra investigation, was counselor to Inspector General Michael Bromwich in the United States Department of Justice, and served as law clerk to Judge A. Leon Higginbottom of the United States Court of Appeal for the Third Circuit in Philadelphia. He's published numerous law review articles, including one on the landmark Warren Court decision approving police stop and frisk practices. He's quoted regularly in the print media, articles about legal topics, has appeared on C-SPAN, National Public Radio, the NBC Nightly News, the News Hour with Jim Lehrer, Nightline, and most recently and most famously appeared at Chautauqua Institution Hall of Philosophy with Greg Peterson. It's in your bio. John is a class act. John has been working very hard in unearthing the story of Robert H. Jackson. John, I can say, that was quoted and revered at a installation, or it's actually a changing of the name of the Whitney R. to the Whitney R. Harris Institutional Global Studies in St. Louis. I didn't do that right, but I'll do that later. As the preeminent scholar on Robert H. Jackson. John found us before we found him. He's been working with Harold Adams, nephew of Robert Jackson, working with Kristen Stein at the Fenton Historical Society, and many others to learn about Robert Jackson. We are thrilled that he is willing to be the Elizabeth S. Lene Fellow, and we are thrilled that you're able to join us again, John, and to give us a little talk on Robert Jackson, but also to introduce our principal speaker. John Barrett.
Good evening, and thank you. My wife's question last night when I spoke to her about 10 p.m. was, how are things back home? And I think that's a pretty fair assessment of the warm feeling I've gotten about this region, this community, and particularly you people as I work on this wonderful topic and interest that we all share. I'd like to talk to you briefly about three things tonight: Jamestown, Jackson, and Henry King. And so a few words about first Jamestown. Here's my perspective on the Robert H. Jackson Center, informed by some of the documents and personal private correspondence that surround me in my world of gathered materials in New York. When Justice Jackson died tragically young at age 62 in 1954, he of course was an active Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, and he left an office and storage areas full of paper, a house full of materials, etc. And his children, his widow, his law clerks, other friends began a series of conversations about where the material should go and what the legacy should be and where it should be for Robert Jackson. He obviously had lived and reached his professional success here as a young man and in the prime of his adulthood, but he'd lived in the Washington, D.C. area from 1941 forward for the last 13 years of his life, and that's where all this stuff was. Well, a round of conversations with a range of institutions occurred in that time period. Harvard Law School, Yale Law School, the Library of Congress, the National Archives, Cornell University, etc., etc. But the word that kept coming forward was Jamestown. And it kept coming forward from a couple of directions, from people who were Jamestonians, Jackson's children, Irene Jackson, his widow, and so forth. It came forward because that was home. It always had been and it always would be to Bob Jackson, and they thought that was the right home for his stuff, his legacy, his memory. It also came from the other direction, from people who weren't from Jamestown, from people who just knew Bob Jackson, had been his colleagues on the court, in the Department of Justice, throughout the Roosevelt administration, internationally. And it came because the thing they had always heard about from Bob Jackson was Jamestown. And so the idea really was there and apparent from the beginning. Now, here we are nearly 50 years later, and it really has happened. And I think in a very deep, real, profound way, everyone here gets credit for getting it right. And that's a tremendous achievement. In my particular respect, I'm delighted to accept the Elizabeth S. Linney Fellowship that formalizes my involvement in the work of this wonderful center. Betty, obviously, as you know, has been a tremendous supporter of the concept from the get-go, and she's become a tremendous friend to me, and I'm very grateful, so thank you. My second topic that I would like to touch on is Jackson, and particularly in the context of Law Day, which this year has its theme, Equal Justice Under Law. As you may know, those are the words inscribed over the Supreme Court, above the pillars. That's what it says above the place that I think of as Bob's office. Maybe a little casual, but that's what the Supreme Court is. And those words can be empty and can be totems etched into the marble. But if you take them seriously, they are deep and profound and real and immediate in the way that Steve described so effectively tonight. I think one of the things that equal justice under law meant to Robert Howitt Jackson was space and protection for the individual. And I think that came from his experience, his heritage, his rootedness in this city and in this region. Robert Jackson was, in many ways, always out of step with the mainstream, the consensus, the typical in his communities. He and his family lived the autonomous life of a farm family in Spring Creek Township. They didn't need anybody, and they didn't borrow from anybody, and they got by on what they had, and they did fine. It was not a struggling boyhood that he had. When they moved to Frewsburg, they actually lived across the street, as you might know, from the Baptist church, but they weren't Baptists. In fact, they weren't particularly religious in any respect. And that was something that I think young Bob, age 10 and forward, as he's living in Frewsburg, begins to think about the individual and the community and what pressures and what space is an appropriate way for that to work in this constitutional democracy. He also was influenced and captivated from a very early age by the story of the Kayentone movement, which had been a spiritualism movement and had existed in the woods relatively close to the homestead where he had grown up, in that region near the state line. And he would go tromping through the woods and looking at the structures and thinking about spiritualism and religious distinction that allowed people to take space, to have land, to be together, to pursue their lawful ends in a community of freedom. And that moved him, and we know it because he wrote a moving essay about it in the last year of his life. unpublished, but I think really very powerfully revealing. It also, I think, is something that came from his experience here in Jamestown. For as a young practicing lawyer, he was also a very active person in the world of politics of the Democratic variety, in a town that in his time, and for most of its history, as I understand it, has been more Republican than Democratic. Although in 1936, Chautauqua County went for Roosevelt, in which Bob Jackson took great pride. Of course, he won everywhere except Maine and Vermont. But anyway, Jackson, as the Democrat, was fighting an uphill battle, and in a way that involved contact with a lot of people who never sort of saw his point politically, but admired his belief and gave him the space. And I think that too became part of the individualism, the equal justice under law that really frames his life. One of his most powerful Supreme Court opinions, as you may know, was written in his first term on the court. It was decided on Flag Day, 1942. It's the case of West Virginia Board of Education versus Barnett. And what it struck down was a West Virginia statute that compelled students to salute the flag at the beginning of the school day. The Supreme Court had upheld such a statute just 3 years earlier, but Jackson, leading a group of new justices, persuaded a couple of old justices to change their mind. And the Supreme Court, in that time of war, created space for nonconformists, for individuals of a different adherence than the majority. He wrote those powerful words, "In this country, the only fixed star in the constitutional constellation is that there is no orthodoxy prescribed by government." I think that is part of what grew here and came to find a place in American constitutional law. And finally, Nuremberg, I think, should be understood as a place of vindication, protection, appreciation for the individual defendants who got a fair trial by a prosecutor carrying a burden of proof, individual defendants who received counsel, who received procedural protections of the type they had never, of course, afforded their victims, and justice for those individual victims in the crimes that were defined and prosecuted and the verdicts that were achieved at the Nuremberg trial. So Robert Jackson, individual, is one way to think about Robert Jackson as American. Individual is my segue to our main guest tonight, Henry T. King, Jr., one of the most powerful and distinctive individuals I'm privileged to call a friend. Henry, in an extraordinary life, twice the length of mine and about 10 times the accomplishment, has done some of these things, and this only scratches the surface. He is a son of Connecticut, literally the son of a former mayor of Meriden, Connecticut, and he grew up in a house that valued public service and viewed the individual's place as important and primary, and part of the job to be to pay it back to the community. He attended the Choate School, Yale College, Yale Law School, and had interesting companions at each step of the way. At Choate, he was with JFK. At Yale College, he was with William Eldred Jackson, the justice's son. And at Yale Law School, he was with and he was of that generation that Raleigh and Tom Brokaw and all of us rightly think of as the greatest, because they confronted the challenge of their time in different ways. Some fought, some brought law to the wreckage of the aftermath. Henry King is one of those men. He got out of law school and briefly began to practice in Wall Street, and then pursued the much bigger challenge of moving to Nuremberg and joining the staff of the American Chief of Counsel, Robert H. Jackson, at the International Military Tribunal. He arrived in Nuremberg in March of 1946 during the trial, literally just before and in time to witness Robert Jackson cross-examining Erhard Milch, who was one of the early defense witnesses, the former deputy chief of the Luftwaffe, who had been called to testify as a defense witness by Hermann Goering, his boss. And Jackson had his way with Milch, and the development of that evidence and the preparation for many of the key aspects in the remainder of the trial included the efforts of Henry King. Henry King stayed at Nuremberg and was part of the subsequent proceedings, the American prosecutions of leading Nazis who weren't part of the initial group of defendants. And the first case that was ready to go, thanks to Henry's diligent work, was the American prosecution of Erhard Milch. In that case, Milch was charged with crimes against humanity and war crimes, focusing on two spheres of activity. One was the Nazi system of slave labor that had conscripted the populations not only of Germany but of all the overrun countries of Europe to rebuild and maintain the Nazi military menace, and particularly the air machine. And the second phase of the charges in the proof against Milch was his involvement in the horrible medical experimentation that was done to people in the concentration camps. Now, that trial began in late 1946 and concluded in early 1947. Henry's part of the case was the slave labor aspect of the case. That was the proof he developed. Those were the witnesses and the evidence that he handled. And it may just be a coincidence, but I think not, that Milch was convicted on the slave labor aspect of the case. And although the tribunal found that the experimentation was well proved, Milch's personal involvement wasn't proven sufficiently, and Milch was acquitted on those charges. But having been convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity for the slave labor, Milch received a life sentence and served more than a decade before he was paroled and released. And that is Henry's prosecutorial accomplishment at Nuremberg. Following his return, Henry had a distinguished and varied legal career. It included vast private practice, including in-house experience for many years at the TRW Corporation. He settled in Cleveland, Ohio. He became a professor of law at the Case Western Reserve University, where he heads the United States Canadian Law Institute and is one of the preeminent experts in international law. Henry King is a powerful writer, as you will see in his book, which I encourage you to read. He is a powerful speaker, as you're about to hear, and it is a privilege to have him here this evening at the Jackson Center. Henry T. King, Jr.
John, I hope I can live up to that wonderful introduction. I'm very happy to be here. I congratulate Greg Peterson and his team, including John and others, for the establishment of the Robert Jackson Center. It's a tremendous achievement. It's not unlikely that my papers on Nuremberg will find their way into the archives of the Robert Jackson Center when that time comes. So I can't say more than that. Well, I'm going to talk tonight about a subject that's very dear to me. That's Robert Jackson and international human rights. There's no greater challenge currently facing the international community than that of defining the scope of international human rights. At this instant, the world is engaged in a global war on terrorism, and it's compelled to face the challenges of dealing with the human elements of this war, whether in the form of refugees reverting from the bombarded landscape of Afghanistan, citizens subject to midnight raids and arrests in the streets of Pakistan, or those who have been captured and sent to distant prisons to be later tried by military tribunals, such as those people being held at Guantanamo Bay. Similarly, on this very day, the world seeks to convict and punish those who have allegedly violated the rights of countless citizens, as witnessed in the trials of Slobodan Milosevic in The Hague, as well as the Rwandan War Crimes Tribunal. I raise these issues not to promote or resolve the vigorous debate that such topics generate among governments, scholars, practitioners, pundits, and the media. Rather, I offer them as a symbol of where we have come during the past half century since the Nuremberg War Crimes trial. I ask you, why is the torture of summary execution of the Al-Qaeda prisoners beyond the scope of our imagination? Why are Slobodan Milosevic and his henchmen sent to trial rather than to the roaring mobs in order to be brutally tortured and executed, as the case of Mussolini after World War II? The answer is simply that the world refuses to accept such practices and will deem such conduct a violation of basic human rights. As elementary as the concept is to those of examining the issue from a 21st century perspective, let us remember that this answer was not always so readily accepted. For example, as World War II began to wind down, the question arose as to what to do with the alleged perpetrators of the worst conflagration in history. There were those who proposed summary execution of those alleged to be responsible for this horror. They included such distinguished statesmen as Winston Churchill and Henry Morgenthau, the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury. Cordell Hull, the U.S. Secretary of State, favored drumhead courts-martial designed primarily to convict the defendants. Joseph Stalin was reported by Winston Churchill to favor summary executions, but was willing to go through a judicial process designed to convict the defendants. For their part, certain British officials wanted to take the top Nazi criminals out and shoot them without warning, announce to the world that they were dead. But a dissenting voice was heard, that of Henry L. Stimson, the U.S. Secretary of War, who favored a trial, a fair trial. His voice was powerfully joined by that of Supreme Court Justice Robert H. Jackson, who on April 13, 1945, in an address before the American Society of International Law, announced that he favored a trial of the Nazis based on justice. Jackson said that the U.S. should not want nothing to do with proceedings which were designed expressly to convict defendants. Jackson wanted convictions of defendants based on solid evidence. If the evidence to convict was not there, he favored the freeing of the defendant. According to Jackson, the trial should be placed on the principle of justice for all. On May 2, 1945, President Truman charged Justice Jackson with leading the U.S. team to prosecute the Nazi leadership. Justice Jackson then transmuted his earlier statements into practice when he negotiated with the Allies the London Charter of August 8, 1945, which was the basis for the Nuremberg war crimes trial. In negotiating the London Charter, Jackson insisted on a presumption of innocence, while the USSR representatives endorsed a presumption of guilt. Jackson stuck to his conviction, and on this issue he prevailed. The result at Nuremberg of Jackson's position was that 3 defendants who otherwise might have been convicted were acquitted. This gave meaning to the Nuremberg trial as a symbol of justice, which otherwise it might not have had. It demonstrated that at the most momentous trial in history, the principle of fairness had prevailed. At Nuremberg, Jackson further insisted that the defendants have counsel of their own choosing. Thus, a cadre of top German lawyers, including the leaders of German bar, was offered as defense counsel to the Nazi defendants. I can say firsthand, on the basis of personal experience, that they put up a terrific defense for their claims. Few who were there will ever forget the efforts of Alfred Kranzmüller, counsel for the defendant Karl Dönitz, the Nazi U-boat chieftain and Hitler's anointed successor, and also Hermann Jarreis, the great eminence of the German defense staff, and counsel for the defendant Alfred Jodl, the commander-in-chief of the German armies on the Western Front. They fought to the ultimate for their clients, and Kranzmüller indeed was successful in getting the sentence for his client, a confirmed Nazi, limited to 10 years in Spandau prison. In the evidentiary phase of the Nuremberg trials, Jackson's approach again offered fairness to the defendants. Jackson wanted the primary Nuremberg case against the Nazis to be substantiated by their own documents. He wanted less reliance on the testimony of witnesses. And this approach precipitated a critical dispute with William J. Donovan, his presumed deputy, who wanted the case to be based on greater use of witnesses. Jackson prevailed, and Donovan went home. It was Jackson's view that Nuremberg would have greater historic credibility if the Nuremberg cases were based on the defendants' own documents. Ultimately, the defendants at Nuremberg convicted themselves with Jackson's approach. This approach also fortified the credibility and historic significance of the trial. It also meant that where there was no documentary support for a conviction, the defendant had to be acquitted, as in fact was the case with 3 of the defendants. Notwithstanding the revolutionary approach to fairness implemented by Jackson at Nuremberg, the proceedings were not without their critic. For example, Chief Justice Stone stated that Jackson was away, quote, conducting his high-class lynching party, and that proceedings were about the victor over the vanquished. Similarly, U.S. Senator Robert A. Taft condemned Nuremberg judgment as ex post facto law and argued that the proceedings, quote, would discredit the whole idea of justice in Europe for the years to come, end of quote. Perhaps the most telling response to the critics of Jackson and Nuremberg were those of the defendants at the trial. Hans Frank, the defendant who served as the Nazi governor general of occupied Poland, stated, quote, I regard this trial as a God-will court to examine and put an end to the terrible era of suffering under Adolf Hitler, end of quote. With the same theme but a different emphasis, defendant Albert Speer, Hitler's war production minister, said, quote, this trial is necessary. There is a shared responsibility for such horrible crime, even in an authoritarian state, end of quote. Dr. Theodor Kleefisch, a member of the German defense team, wrote, it is obvious that the trial and judgment of such proceedings require of the tribunal the utmost impartiality, loyalty, and sense of justice. The Nuremberg tribunal has met all these requirements with consideration and dignity. Nobody dares to doubt that it was guided by the search for truth and justice from the first day to the last day of this tremendous trial, end of quote. That's the Nazi speaking. It is this legacy of justice and fairness that has led legal scholars and historians to state that Nuremberg marked the effective start of the international human rights movement. I believe that this is true. For example, under the Crimes Against Humanity count of the London Charter, certain offenses against human beings which warrant punishment are defined. In stating that these are offenses, this count supports the view that human beings have the right to protection against these crimes. The thrust of this is to recognize by negative implication certain international human rights. Additionally, in the Crimes Against Humanity count as developed in the London Charter for use at Nuremberg, it is stated that local law offers no out for those charged with these crimes. Put succinctly, this meant that Hitler's oral order for, quote, the final solution for the extermination of the Jewish race offered no defense for those defendants who were charged with this offense. This was the first time that authorization by local or national authority was rejected as a defense in human rights cases. For the first time in history, human rights had achieved an international dimension. The Nuremberg rulings in the slave labor cases involving Albert Speer, Fritz Sauckel, and Erhard Milch confirmed that forced slavery is an international crime and should be punished as such. The rulings in the Göring and Frank cases on offenses against the Jews are also a vital part of Nuremberg. But above all, in the subsequent Nuremberg proceedings, the findings of the courts in the Einsatzgruppe case, medical experience, and justice cases reflect the conviction that human rights are not solely a matter of national jurisdiction, but that a higher law, international law, is applicable in such cases, and that human beings have status under this law. As a follow-up to Nuremberg, the UN sponsored several human rights convention declarations. There was, first of all, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, followed by the Genocide Convention, which the U.S. took 40 years to ratify, and then with many reservations, and the Convention Against Torture. These conventions have been ratified by many countries in the world, and they constitute collectively an international law of human rights based on conventions and customs, and also the Nuremberg Principles, which were endorsed by the UN General Assembly on December 14, 1946. The Security Council resolutions covering the crimes in the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda incorporate the Nuremberg Principles in the protection of international human rights when they refer to, quote, crimes against humanity and genocide, end quote. The same can be said for the Rome Statute covering the establishment of an international criminal court, which I am happy to say has now been ratified by more than 60 countries, thus going into effect. Leading democracies of the world, except for the U.S., are now party to the treaty. Unfortunately, the U.S., which signed but has not ratified the treaty, is even considering withdrawing its signature, which was authorized by President Clinton. Here, I would observe only that to sign a document with erasable ink diminishes the credibility of the signer. I believe that this would also offend our allies who have ratified the treaty, such as Canada, the UK, and the entire European community. I believe that U.S. efforts to sabotage the International Criminal Court, which are not the primary focus of my remarks here today, are contrary to everything Robert Jackson and Nuremberg stood for. Always remember that the innocent need never fear the rule of law, and accepting law to bind everyone was Justice Jackson's dream and legacy. Robert Jackson's contribution to international human rights is found also in his endorsement of the principles of universal jurisdiction. As Jackson said in his opening statement at Nuremberg on November 21, 1946, quote, "The complaining party at your bar today is civilization." And he'd added that as we pass a poisoned chalice to the lips of these defendants, we pass it to our lips as well. The Nuremberg court applied the concept of universal jurisdiction when it said that the nations who were plaintiffs at Nuremberg were doing collectively what each one of them could have done individually. In essence, what Jackson was saying was that some crimes which were dealt with at Nuremberg were so terrible, such as the crimes against humanity, that they could be dealt with by any court taking jurisdiction, because they were crimes against all humanity, literally and collectively. The court in the Eichmann case applied this concept in convicting Adolf Eichmann of crimes against the Jews, which at the time of their commission had no legal standing in Israel because Israel was not then a nation state. There was no Israeli law in effect when the crimes were committed, which Eichmann could be charged with violating. But, said the court, these were crimes which were so massive that they were crimes against all humanity, and it held that Eichmann should pay with his life for their commission. The U.S. Court of Appeals in the Demaniak case also endorsed this concept, and it is included in the restatement of the Foreign Relations Law of the United States. The concept is now firmly entrenched, as witnessed during its recent application in the trials of Chilean dictator Augusto Pinochet. The inheritance of Nuremberg in Europe is reflected in the creation of the European Court of Human Rights and the convention on which it is based. Under the convention, an individual located in a member state who feels that his individual rights as defined by the convention are violated by his country can bring a proceeding against his country to establish his rights. If the court confirms his rights under the convention, the country must abide by the European Court's ruling. The court may also award damages. As I have stated, Jackson's concept on human rights are explicitly set forth in the London Charter and in his presentation in the prosecution case. These concepts are firmly established today as we see presumption of innocence and the right to counsel as pillars of international criminal jurisprudence. Moreover, Jackson's decision to convict defendants with their own documents is on stage at the Milosevic trial in The Hague, where Chief Prosecutor Carlo de la Ponte is presenting volumes of the Yugoslavian leaders' former documents in an effort to demonstrate the crimes of genocide. Robert Jackson added a new dimension to the rights of individuals in our world of today, an international dimension. This dimension will expand and become firmly entrenched in the world of the future. We are indeed all citizens of the world, and this must be confirmed by a rule of law governing human rights for all of us. Robert Jackson's raw courage in pressing forward at Nuremberg for the establishment for a new rule of law governing human rights has vastly impacted our world of today. It means that all people are human beings, and that as human beings, we ultimately have certain inalienable rights which warrant recognition. Jackson's dream has not yet been ultimately implemented, but I am confident that with the passage of time, we will recognize, as he did, our common humanity. As we celebrate Law Day here in Jamestown, Robert Jackson's hometown, I ask each of you to honor his memory and his legacy through a commitment to vigilance in the face of continuing onslaughts on international human rights. He led the way. Our job is to follow the blueprints which he left for us and for all humankind. The road ahead will not be easy, but it is a smooth highway when compared to the uncharted territory which Jackson faced and conquered. Truly, Robert Jackson was a giant of a man whose dignity, courage, and brilliance changed the course of history, guiding us to a new day when justice, tempered both with both compassion for victims and fairness to perpetrators, will rule the world. Thank you.
The Jackson Center is a historical and educational facility dedicated to preserving the legacy of this country lawyer who became Solicitor General, Attorney General, a Justice of the Supreme Court, and served as Chief Prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials of Nazi war criminals following World War II. To learn more about this program, Robert Jackson, the Jackson Center, and upcoming events, the Jackson Center is located at 305 East 4th Street, Jamestown, New York, and found on the web at www.roberthjackson.org or contacted by telephoning 716-483-6646.